أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Here we are to continue with dealing with the objections of this individual who presented some objections about some of the narrations that we mentioned in our series about the martyrdom of Fatima al-Zahra salamun alayha. We responded to the first objection, which was about the narration from Al-Kafi in the first part of the series. And in this episode, we want to go on to the second objection. Let's see the objection.
This is Dala al-Imama, right? By Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustum Tabari. Okay, so this guy, Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustum Tabari, allegedly wrote this book. Allegedly. Let's get into this. There are a few issues with this book. First of all, the author of the book is quoting a late narrator, a very, very, very late narrator, and his name is Abu Abdullah al-Hussein bin Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Habib. Now, this person passed away in the year 447. So the author of this book is a student of someone who passed away in the 5th century. There's an issue with the book. I mean, if you open it up from the beginning, it says that this author is someone who passed away in the 4th century, which is quite strange. Now, what's even more problematic is what we do know about Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustum Tabari is that he actually died in the 3rd century. Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustum is a student of Sufyan bin Waqi', who passed away in the middle of the 3rd century. So Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustum passed away towards the end of the 3rd century. So I know it's a bit confusing, but please bear with me. Now, some very reasonable intellectual Shia scholars like Tustari came to the conclusion that this book was misattributed to Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustam. However, some other Shia scholars came to a very unreasonable conclusion. They said that there are two people with the same name. They're both called Abu Ja'far. They're both called Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustam. They're both from Tabaristan. They're both Tabari. And they're both Shias. And they both wrote a book about Imamah. Now, that's really unlikely, especially since the late Muhammad bin Jarir al-Tabari, who allegedly passed away in the 5th century, doesn't have any biography. You don't find classical Shi'i scholars writing a passage for him in their books of Rijal. They only write one for the early Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustam al-Tabari, the 3rd century one. They don't mention this other Muhammad bin Jarir bin Rustam al-Tabari. So that person, this second person, doesn't exist. So that is a major issue that you have with this hadith. You may like the chain seems sahih, but the book is not sahih.
So basically, there are two books which are in question. The first book is Al-Mustarshid fil Imama, which has been written by Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rastam al-Tabari al-Kabir, which means the older Tabari. And this has been mentioned by our scholars like Sheikh al-Tusi, Sheikh al-Najaj. Sheikh al-Tusi, for example, mentions Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rastam al-Tabari in his book Al-Fihras, which is a list of all authors, and then he mentions his chain of narrations to those authors and to their books and so on and so forth. And he mentions in this case Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rastam al-Tabari al-Kabir, the older one, Yukanna Abu Ja'far, and then he mentions that this is not the Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari Abi Ja'far, who is the historian, and then says that from among his books is the book Al-Mustarshid. Similarly, also Sheikh al-Najashi mentions Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rastam al-Tabari Al-Amuli Abu Ja'far, and then he says he's from among our great scholars and very knowledgeable and trustworthy in hadith and so on and so forth. And from among his books is Al-Mustarshid fil Imam, and then he mentions the chain of narration of his to the author and to that book and to his other books. So this is the book Al-Mustarshid fil Imama, and the author of that book, who is Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rastam al-Tabari. And the book Al-Mustarshid fil Imama exists in our time as well. So if you Google it online, you can find it and download the PDF of the book, a copy, and then read it for yourself. The content is basically Kalami. He was born in the 3rd century and passed away in the 4th century. And the statement of At-Tusi here hints to another fact, and that is that he mentions that there is a Kabir. There is Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Kabir, the older one. So it hints to the existence of a Saghir, or a younger Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari, which we'll be discussing in this video. So there is another book which is in question, the book Dalal al-Imama, and that is a book about biographies of the infallibles, starting from the Messenger of Allah, Amir al-Mu'mineen salam, Fatima al-Zahra salam alayha, until the last Imam. And this book had two volumes. So the first volume was about the Messenger of Allah and Amir al-Mu'mineen salam, the biographies and the stories about them and their miracles and so on and so forth. The second part, which is existing today, has survived, is what we have as Dalal al-Imama, but it's not the entire book. It's just the second volume of the book, which is starting from the biography of Fatima al-Zahra salamun alayha until the last Imam. Our earliest scholars had the entire book, like Sayyid ibn Tawus, who was born 589 and passed away 664. He had the entire two volumes of the book, and he quotes from this book a lot in many books. And here, for example, we have Al-Yaqeen. He says that from the first volume of the book Ad-Dalail, which is written by the Sheikh, the trustworthy Sheikh Abi Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, and then he mentions the narration, quotes the narration. There is, for example, in Iqbal al-A'mal, he mentions the complete name of the author and says from Sheikh al-Thiqa, the trustworthy Sheikh Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari al-Imami, in the book Dalal al-Imama. So here he mentions the complete name of the author and his book, the name of the book. And in other books, he quotes a lot from in a lot of his other books, and he says that he has a chain of narrators to the author, to this book, to the entire book, that he is narrating the entire book with his chain of narrations, not just a found book somewhere without any connection to the author, but it's rather a chain of narrators from Sayyid ibn Tawus until the author Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari. In his book Kashf al-Mahajja, which is basically his will to his son, he discusses many topics with his son in this book, and then at one point, he mentions also the books about maqamat, or the status of the imams and their miracles and so on and so forth. He recommends to his son, and he says that I've saved for you a bunch of books about this topic. And from among them, he mentions the book Al-Hujjah from Al-Kafi by Kulaini, and then the second book he mentions Al-Ma'rifa of Ibrahim ibn Ishaq al-Thaqafi, and then the third book he mentions Dalal al-Imama of Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari. So he trusted the book, the author, and that's also obvious from many quotes that he has in his different books from Dalal al-Imama. So with this, we see that Dalal al-Imama is also from Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari by the testimony of Sayyid ibn Tawus, who was very close to the time of the author. And here we would say that in Taus and mentioning the book Dalal al-Imama, we fulfill the hint that Sheikh al-Tusi was mentioning, that there is a Kabir, a older Tabari, Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rassam al-Tabari, so there should be a younger, and this is the younger one. He was from the generation of Sheikh al-Tusi and so on. But they haven't mentioned him in their books. They have not mentioned a lot of other peers of them, and later scholars have mentioned those names. For example, Sheikh al-Karajiki has not been mentioned in their books and so on, which is a very great big scholar. Like Najashi himself has not been mentioned in the book of the Tusi, even though they were classmates and they had the same teachers and so on and so forth. But Najashi mentions Sheikh al-Tusi, for example. In any case, Dalal al-Imama is written by Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rassam al-Tabari according to Sayyid ibn Tawus, and he considers him a trustworthy scholar and a great sheikh. But this individual brought up the objections of Sheikh al-Tustari, that al-Tustari has mentioned that the author of this book is some unknown person, and basically Sayyid ibn Tawus is the first person who might have confused or falsely attributed the book Dalal al-Imama to Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam, who is the author of Al-Mustarshid. Whereas there is no proof for that, and that's basically a guesswork. And At-Tustari, who is like passed away like 30 years ago, has some unique kind of methodology when it comes to researching such topics. In any case, his opinions are not supported with evidence, and he bases all his claim upon conjecture. So his conjecture, his guesswork is that maybe Sayyid ibn Tawus, because he had the entire book, at the beginning of the chain, he had seen Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari and thought, okay, this book should belong to him. But this is just a guesswork, first of all, because we don't have the first volume and we don't know what was written there. And secondly, such guesswork has no value. It has no credibility. You cannot base an opinion upon such a guesswork. Scholars like Sheikh Mamakani, who is a much credible scholar in this field, especially, mentions that the summary of this, that yes, these two, Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari, Abu Ja'far, there are two of them, and both of them, one of them is Al-Kabir, which Sheikh Tusi Najashi mentions, As-Saghir, which has been mentioned by Sayyid ibn Tawus, and he quotes from him a lot from his book, and he says that both of these Tabaris, both of them are trustworthy. Thiqatan, Adlan, they're upright and they're trusted scholars, and both of them had a book about Imamah, but not the same book as I mentioned. One of them is Dalal al-Imamah, which is completely different content than Al-Mustarshid fil Imamah, which is for the older Tabari, and both of those books fortunately exists today. The author of Dalal al-Imamah has actually another book also which exists today, and that is Nawadar al-Mu'ajizat, for example. That book is, in that book he summarizes the things that he has mentioned in the Dalal al-Imamah. He mentions also some additional miracles for the Imams and for the Prophet, but that's another topic. So with this, we proved that our earlier scholars like Sayyid ibn Tawus and our later great Rijali scholars like Sheikh Mamakani have mentioned that the author of Dalal al-Imamah is Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustam al-Tabari, and he is the younger Tabari. And it's not something uncommon in the books that some narrators or scholars have same kunya, same name, same father's name, same grandfather's name, and they are from the same place. For some of those names, I have seen like 20 people who have the same name, same father's name, same grandfather's name, same kunya, more than 20 people. Can you imagine that? And best example we can give from Bukhari. Bukhari is the the most famous scholar that they have, and he has a book by the name Tarikh al-Kabir, which is a very famous book of biographies of narrators and scholars and so on. And there he mentions two people with the same name, same father's name, same grandfather's name, same kunya, and they are from the same place. And one of them is the grandson of the other one. The grandfather is Ali ibn Nasr ibn Ali al-Azdi al-Jahzami al-Basri. His kunya was Abu al-Hasan. And his grandson is Ali ibn Nasr ibn Ali ibn Nasr ibn Ali Abu al-Hasan al-Jahzami al-Basri. And in addition to all this, if you look into the narration of Dalal al-Imamah, the third person in the chain of narration in that book is Muhammad ibn Hammam ibn Suhail, who is a very famous scholar, Shia scholar. It was contemporary to Sheikh al-Kulaini. And this person, and this scholar, had a book also written about Tariq, about history, a biography of the infallibles. And there is a summary of that book which is still existing today. And if you look into that book, which is called Muntakhab al-Anwar, the original book was called Anwar fi Tarikh al-A'immat al-Athar, and there is a Muntakhab, a summary of that book currently, as I said, and he starts the biographies of infallibles starting from the Messenger of Allah with the same chain that he mentions, that we have seen quoted in Dalal al-Imamah. Then he mentions biography of Fatima al-Zahra salam alayha, what we see in Dalal al-Imamah, the entire thing, and then Amir al-Mu'minin and so on and so forth. So with the same chain of narrations, he mentions the biographies of infallibles. This chain of narration, as I said, is the same. So it could be that the Tabari has directly narrated from this book of Muhammad ibn Hammam ibn Suhail, or directly from him through another book, or directly just a narration, a singular narration that he had narrated directly from Muhammad ibn Hammam ibn Suhail. In any case, we see in the content of this narration some parts which completely correlates with the content of the narration that we have in Dalal al-Imamah. But since this, as I said, this book is a summary, some later scholar has removed some parts. Content has been shortened and deleted. In any case, we see, for example, the part which mentions that Fatima al-Zahra salam alayha stayed in Mecca for 8 years and in Medina for 10 years, and after the death of her father, she lived 75 days. This is the same wording, the same part that we see also in Dalail al-Imamah, which correlates completely. We see also وَأَسْقَطَتْ مُحْسَنًا, that Fatima al-Zahra miscarried a baby by the name Muhassin or Muhsin. So this is an additional proof for the content of the narration of At-Tabari and also for the book itself as well. With this, we refuted another shot in the dark by this individual about the narrations that we presented in our series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.